When you couple up, you are very often sharing the financial burden of lots of things: the roof over your head, the food in your fridge, the cost of vacation, all these things you pull together when you're with someone else. That is not the case if you're single. And in fact, there's those that argue there are some real unfair disadvantages for those who haven't formed their family in that way. We're going to talk about that. Our guest is Renée Sylvestre-Williams, and she wrote a book called The Singles Tax: the No Nonsense Financial Advice for Solo Earners. There, I did that right. Welcome, Renée. There is a lot to chew on here. What exactly is the singles tax as you define it?
The singles tax, as I define it, is sort of the financial penalty or consequences that singles pay by existing and living in the society that we are currently in.
Oh, that's very succinct. What are some examples of that? I mean, you spend a whole book describing all of them, but give us a flavor.
I mean, it basically starts when, say, you move out of your parents' house, right? Especially in the era that we're in, where rent, it has been dropping, obviously, but rent's still high, especially if you want to move to a popular city or if you want to buy a house, right? You are shouldering those hard costs, which can be split if you are partnered or coupled up, right? Married or coupled up, right?
It makes perfect sense. And yet you outline a pretty stark reality here of the various ways in which that manifests and really affects people directly. I was surprised that in the book, very early on, you talk about building a team. So before you
hmm
got into the specifics of, budgeting and all that stuff, you talk
hmm
about building the team. Who should be on that team?
Your team should actually consist of your friends and experts. Now, your experts could become your friends and all of those things, but you should have friends and you should have experts. But let's talk experts first. You need some lawyers, right? I always say, get an employment lawyer. All right. If anything happens, we're in a current like low hire, low fire situation. There are layoffs have happened, layoffs might be coming. You need an employment lawyer to make sure that you are best positioned during that situation, during a layoff. All right, they can get you more money. Like an example that I use is I was working for a media organization and I was there for less than a year. So legally, they could give me a week and then they gave me another week. And I was like, oh, absolutely not. Got an employment lawyer, got 12 weeks
Wow.
instead.
Wow.
Right?
Now,
Yeah.
how does that differ for someone who's in a couple? Because it seems like that's a service that everybody should have access to if they were in a similar circumstance. What's different if you're on your own?
I would say and yes, absolutely, I agree. Everybody should have a team around them. But what I think what differentiates it is, I would say, even more important to have that team in place or at least have contact information because you do not have another income to fall back on.
Right.
Now, if you're lucky and you're not a contractor gig worker, you would get access to EI, but EI
Yeah.
is not full income replacement. So it is actually better for you to have this team so you are more financially set.
Now, there are some systemic issues. So there are some things in your book that are like, yeah, you're one person, not two. So you're going to probably pay some more on groceries because you're
hmm
buying less quantity. So there's some of
hmm
those things that are super intuitive. Some of
hmm
the things are more systemic and more surprising. What would be
hmm
some examples of those things?
Well, what's really interesting is, if you look at sort of the tax code, right? Everybody files individually, right? But the tax code has evolved, or even if like from the beginning with the tax code, there's always been sort of areas where couples benefit, even if they file individually. Now, a lot of that does happen post-retirement where there's income splitting. So the higher earning partner can drop down into a lower tax level. Now, if you are a single person and you are fortunate to be you were a higher earning single person, and let's say, you did well, you got good retirement, you don't get that advantage. Now, people are like, oh, well, okay, couples. But then what people don't realize is the same thing happens if your partner dies, right? And you get the spousal benefits. That could bump you up into a higher tax bracket as well. So this isn't something that just affects people who choose to be single. If
Mm.
you are widowed, this is something that happens as well.
Yeah. I was talking to a 62-year-old, very successful individual, lifelong single person
hmm
who articulated some real anxiety about the retirement phase of his life, even though he's a
Hmm.
real income earner and I'm sure he's got a significant nest egg. But
Hmm.
there was a psychological worry that he had that I don't hear nearly so often for people who are in a couple. Talk a bit about how singletons sometimes can find themselves in a circumstance in which there's just additional anxiety because they're solo.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting because I've had those conversations with people kind of like once they figured out what I write about. And a lot of that, yes, there's that financial anxiety, but then there's that community and care
Yeah.
anxiety that comes in as well. Because like caregiving in Canada, and we can extrapolate across the world, tends to be billions and trillions of dollars, often unpaid, and does fall on the shoulders of family members, a lot of the time, mostly women, right? Unpaid caregiving. And if you are partnered up, your partner, your spouse, right, providing they are physically and mentally capable, would often be doing a lot of the caregiving. Or if you have children, them as well. So if you are single without children, there is that fear of who's going to look after me when I get older.
Yeah.
Right? What do I do? Like, I want to age at home. Do I want to go to perhaps like a senior living situation and then from there transition to long-term care when you get old enough and we're looking like closer to death, right? These are, and not knowing what that happen, not knowing what your plan is around that can actually drive a lot of anxiety. And then on top of that, how are you going to pay for
Yeah. Yeah, you
it?
don't have the inherent diversification of two
Yeah,
humans. Because
exactly.
hopefully, with two humans, if one person needs significant care, the other one won't. Whereas when you're solo, it's all on you. I
It's
want
all
to
on you.
I want to talk a bit more about the estate planning piece because
Hmm.
we know the stats are horrendous in Canada for adults who have wills. It's somewhat less of an issue if you were to die in a couple because the law says, well, it's all going to the surviving spouse, and then you bought yourself some more time. When you're solo, it's a very different thing. What's your
Hmm.
call to action for single folks on ensuring that there's a plan in place here?
Get a will and get an estate plan, right? So the will kicks in after you die. The estate plan, obviously, and then POAs for health and property, that's while you're alive, right?
Yeah.
And I think both are important. Obviously, they do two different things, but having an estate plan is also really, really important. It designates the people who, well, you designate people who will help you, who will help look after you if you are not physically or mentally capable, right? And you can lay that out as detailed as you want, right? So while you're alive, you have a plan, right? And then your will, right? Because you are single, if you die intestate without a will, right? The province or state that you are in, those guidelines determine who gets what. Now, if you are not close to your biological family, right? They may get your assets. They
Right.
may get what's left of your estate. And if you don't like them, well, this is why you need a will, right? I don't care if you're doing it to be petty, but like make
Right.
a will. Now, if you are a member of the 2 LGBTQIA community, right? Especially if you are a trans person, it also ideally affords you added protection to make sure that you are not dead named, right? That you are treated hopefully respectfully by the medical community, that you are buried according to the guidelines, that you can have, like, if you have a funeral of whether it's a religious one or otherwise, that it goes to how you want. I also think it's really, really important for that.
This conversation around the single tax lives at the level of policy and
Hmm.
systems. This show and my particular focus is on the individual and with
Hmm.
what's within their circle of control. And what I appreciated most about your book, it's really practical. It gives some real, like, do this, do that, do this, do that. We've talked about some of those things as it relates to the will and that. But if you were to choose two or three things that are the single most critical things over and above the will and the estate plan,
Hmm.
what would you say is most important for single folks to do?
From a practical standpoint, I think one of the most important things to do is understand where you are financially. Obviously, the book is a finance book. And as I say, you may not like where you are, but that knowledge is that no having that knowledge is power. What you do with it is up to you,
Yeah.
obviously, right? But just have an idea of where you are. And I think after that, like you don't have there's nine chapters in this book. There's a lot of tips. You don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
But know where you are financially. What you do with that is up to you. But I think after that, I think it boils down to like having your team and, like work on your friendships because like I think community is important for everybody as we all learned coming out of the pandemic. But I think when you're single, it is also even more important to build
Yeah.
that community around you.
100%. Renee, congrats on the book. Thank you for adding something really critical into this broad conversation about helping people get a better handle on their money so they can live the life they want. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Renée Sylvestre-Williams has written a book called The Singles Tax: No Nonsense Financial Advice for Solo Earners.